I was sitting at my kitchen table in Portland on October 12th, the kettle just beginning to hum, when my phone lit up at 10:03 a.m. $15,000 transferred. Your account is closed. For a moment my heart simply stopped. My hands went cold, then started to tremble so badly I had to set the mug down. This was my Bank of Oregon account, the one I'd built slowly, carefully, and the signature on the notice wasn't mine. It said Evan Jenkins, my son. I stared at the screen waiting for it to correct itself, waiting for sense to return. How could my own son do this to me? I remember thinking that, and then realizing this message was only the beginning. And that's not even the worst. Stay until the end to see how I took back what was mine. My name is Laura Jenkins. I am 68 years old, and for most of my life, numbers made sense to me in a way people often did not. I taught high school math for more than 30 years, the kind of teacher who stayed late to help a struggling student and balanced her checkbook down to the last cent. I retired quietly without a party, proud that I never needed anyone to rescue me. I paid off my small house in Portland, drove the same car for 12 years, and saved every extra dollar I could. By the time I stopped working, I had put away $195,000 with my own hands and discipline. I believed independence was dignity. I believed if you lived carefully, no one could take that from you. Evan is my only child. I raised him after his father left, packing his lunches, checking his homework, showing up for every parent-teacher meeting even when I had papers to grade and exhaustion in my bones. I told myself that the sacrifices were an investment in a decent man. When he grew older and struggled to find his footing, I helped. When he needed rent money, I helped. When his car broke down, I helped. Each time I told myself this was temporary, that a good mother doesn't keep score. Madison came later. She was polite at first, quick to smile, always watching. She spoke softly but listened closely, especially when I talked about finances, about how I planned for emergencies, about how important it was to stay organized. She called me Laura, never Mrs. Jenkins, which I let pass because I didn't want to be difficult. She moved through my house as if she belonged there, opening drawers, using my computer, asking questions that sounded like concern. I was proud of being the kind of mother who could help without losing herself. That pride warmed me for a long time. But somewhere along the way it turned into something heavier. Bitterness, maybe. Or disappointment I didn't want to name. They relied on me more than they admitted. They borrowed and forgot to repay. They promised plans that never quite worked out. Still, they spoke to me gently, reassuringly, as if words alone could cover the imbalance. They thought I would just believe what they said because I always had before. Looking back now, I can see how carefully that trust was handled. How often my questions were brushed aside. How often I was told not to worry. At the time I told myself this was what family looked like. I didn't realize yet that they weren't asking for help anymore. They were positioning themselves to take. The first small crack appeared so quietly that I almost missed it. Evan began hovering whenever I logged into my bank account, standing just behind my chair, offering help I hadn't asked for. He would sigh softly when I typed, then say, "Mom, you always forget the passwords. Let me handle it so you don't stress." The way he said always made my shoulders tighten. I had never forgotten a password in my life without writing it down. Soon, he insisted on managing things temporarily. He reset my banking access on his phone, explaining it was safer that way. When I asked for the new login, he waved a hand and said, "I'll get it to you later." Later never came. Each time I brought it up, he smiled like a patient adult dealing with a confused child. I told myself it was just my pride reacting, nothing more. Madison's role was quieter but sharper. One afternoon, I came home early from the grocery store and found her at my desk, my email open on the screen. She jumped slightly, then laughed it off. "Oh, Evan asked me to check something for you," she said, already closing the window. Her smile lingered a second too long. When I asked what she'd been looking for, she said, "Nothing important," and her eyes slid away from mine. Little things started going missing. Not valuables, just information. Paper statements I kept in a blue folder were rearranged. A sticky note with a security question answer disappeared. Once, when I asked Evan about a small transfer I didn't recognize, Madison stood in the doorway and smirked, just barely, as if she knew something I didn't. The look stayed with me longer than her words. At night, I lay awake listening to the refrigerator hum, replaying conversations in my head. I felt a thin thread of anxiety pulling tighter each day, though I couldn't yet name the reason. Every instinct I had trained myself to trust as a teacher, as a woman who worked with logic, whispered that something was wrong. Still, I told myself not to accuse without proof. I told myself family deserved patience. I didn't even realize then that this was only the beginning, and that my hesitation was exactly what made the next step possible. The ordinary rituals of my life began to slip away, one by one without announcement. One morning after breakfast, I sat down at my desk to check my savings, the same way I had done for years. I typed what I believed was the correct login. The screen blinked once, then showed a flat message: access denied. I tried again, slower this time, carefully. The same result. My chest tightened, not with panic yet, but with confusion. When Evan came home that evening, I mentioned it casually, as if it were nothing. I couldn't get into the account today, I said, keeping my voice light. He didn't look surprised. He didn't even look concerned. He sighed and rubbed his forehead. "Mom, you're always getting mixed up with that stuff," he said. "That's why I told you I'd take care of it. I'm just looking out for you." The words landed harder than he intended, or maybe exactly as he intended. Always confused. I felt myself shrink a little in my chair. Madison was sitting at the counter, scrolling on her phone. She glanced up at me, watched me nod, and the corner of her mouth lifted in a smile she didn't bother to hide this time. It wasn't cruel. It was satisfied. After that, every attempt I made to regain control ended the same way. I asked for balances, and Evan summarized them instead of showing me numbers. I asked for statements, and he said he'd print them later. Later never arrived. When I pressed, he spoke more slowly, more gently, as if volume and patience could replace transparency. "You don't need to worry about every little detail anymore," he said once. "Let us handle it." I began to feel invisible in my own home. The desk where I had once kept neat folders and labeled envelopes now felt like a prop, something decorative rather than functional. Checking my savings had been a quiet reassurance, proof that I was still capable, still aware. Now, even that was denied to me. I watched them move through my days, making plans, having conversations that stopped when I entered the room. In the evenings, I would sit with my tea growing cold, wondering when authority had shifted without my consent. Have you ever felt that way, as if your life was being discussed just out of reach? As if your competence had been quietly voted away? I told myself I was imagining it, but resentment settled in, heavy and unmoving. I didn't know then how deliberate this erosion was. I only knew that something essential was being taken from me long before the money disappeared, and that my silence was being mistaken for surrender. The truth arrived not as a confession, but as paperwork. It was a gray morning when I found the envelope wedged between grocery flyers and a catalog I never ordered. The return address was a medical billing office. I sat at the kitchen table, the same one where I'd once helped Evan with algebra, and opened it slowly. Inside was a copy of a document I did not remember signing, a power of attorney form, dated September 21st. My name was there, written in a shaky version of my handwriting. Under agent it read Evan Jenkins, witnessed by Madison Clark. I felt a hollow open in my chest. September 21st was the day I'd been home recovering from minor surgery, still foggy from anesthesia, sleeping more than waking. I remembered Evan sitting beside my bed, telling me not to worry, telling me he had everything under control. I did not remember signing anything, but the ink insisted otherwise. My phone slipped in my hand as I opened my bank app through the customer service link. This time access was granted briefly, like a door opening just long enough to wound me. I saw the numbers before I could stop myself. $28,000 transferred to a limited liability company in Miami. The transaction date matched the power of attorney. The authorization line listed Evan's signature again, neat and confident. Madison's name appeared where a witness should be. I scrolled further, my vision narrowing. Receipts, fees, transfers I had never approved. Then a note from a local jeweler, thanking Evan for the sale. My mother's bracelet, the ring I wore for 30 years. Sold to cover an apartment deposit I'd heard about only after it was paid. There was no sound in the room, but inside me something screamed. I pressed my hand flat against the table, grounding myself in the familiar grain of the wood. I wanted to shout, to demand answers, to wake them both and force them to look at what they'd done. Instead, I sat very still, watching the evidence line up with terrible clarity. The phone, the documents, the dates, all of it told the same story. This was not carelessness. This was planning. The people I trusted had waited until I was vulnerable, then moved quickly and quietly. The betrayal was complete, signed, witnessed, and filed. In that moment, grief and shock blended into something colder. I understood then that what had been taken was not just money or jewelry. It was consent. And once I saw that, I knew I would never be able to pretend again. I sank into the armchair by the window, the one I'd had since my first apartment, the wood worn smooth where my hands had always rested. The autumn sun spilled across the floor, the kind of golden light that made even the dust motes seem to hold a story. My hands were trembling still, the kind of tremor that comes from shock mixed with an old slow-burning exhaustion. I opened the leather-bound diary I'd kept for decades. Its edges were soft, corners bent from years of nightly scribbles, grocery lists, notes about birthdays, and some tallied in careful ink. Today I needed it for more than memory. I needed it to anchor me, to show me the shape of what had been taken, and what I had allowed with so much trust to drift out of my reach. Flipping the pages, I traced the entries from the past 5 years, counting quietly under my breath. Every single month, a record of what I had given Evan: money, groceries, rides, even the occasional gift card when he insisted it would help with bills, or Madison really needs this. I paused at a September entry from 2 years ago, bought Evan's flight ticket to Miami, for $135. He said he'd cover next week's rent. I had marked it, as usual, in red ink, reminding myself to confirm it later. Later never came, and I had never realized the pattern. Every small transaction, every whispered, "I forgot my password," or, "I'll just handle the account for you," now read like a trail of breadcrumbs through a forest I had walked blindfolded. The truth struck me slowly, like cold water spilling over my chest. They had been methodical, predictable in their manipulation. Evan, my own son, not a child anymore, had learned to cloak entitlement with charm. Madison had been subtle, almost imperceptible in her movements, but her smirk when I asked about the accounts, a tiny curl of lips, a barely there raise of an eyebrow, was etched into my memory now with horrifying clarity. I could see every moment I had brushed off as generosity or helping family, and realize how willingly I had handed them power. The betrayal was not just in the signature on the documents or the money transferred, it was in all the little moments that had taught them over years that they could get away with it. I closed the diary for a moment and looked around the kitchen. The hum of the fridge, the faint smell of lavender from the candle by the sink, the chipped mug I always used for tea, ordinary details that now seemed almost sacred. They reminded me that my life had a center that was mine, and it had not been fully taken. For a long moment I let the quiet wash over me, acknowledging the fear and the shock, letting my chest rise and fall in steady rhythm. I whispered softly, almost to myself, "I'm not a ghost. I will get it all back." It was the first sentence I had spoken that felt fully true since the day I saw the notification. No trembling, no hesitation, just clarity. The diary became a roadmap. I made notes in a fresh notebook, separate and orderly. Every transaction they had taken, every account they had touched, every moment they had misled me would be recorded. I annotated dates, amounts, signatures, and witnesses. The process itself gave me a strange sense of calm. I had always loved numbers, patterns, solving problems, and here was a problem that involved betrayal, yes, but also arithmetic, logic, evidence. I could approach it rationally, systematically. I realized that the panic, the cold knots in my stomach, came not from what they had taken. They were temporary, replaceable, but from the moment I realized how long I had allowed my trust to be manipulated. That acknowledgement, painful as it was, became the foundation for strength. I reflected on the years of my independence. Retired, careful, deliberate, I had saved $195,000 of my own, never counting on anyone else, never letting anyone touch what I had earned. And now, confronted with theft disguised as care, I recognized that the money, the accounts, the jewelry, all of it, were symbols of respect and autonomy. I hadn't lost the principle of ownership, just the illusion that everyone around me would respect it automatically. The realization was sharp, but it cut cleanly. Trust is earned, not assumed, and boundaries must be actively maintained. I thought of Evan, of Madison, of the quiet confidence they had taken from me. And I thought of myself, the steady, meticulous woman who had spent decades ensuring her life had order and dignity. I could choose to be undone by their audacity, or I could reclaim it piece by piece. I felt a low, simmering satisfaction, not revenge, not cruelty, but the certainty that I could act decisively. They had overstepped, underestimated me, relied on my habitual kindness as a shield for their schemes. I no longer needed to shield them from my reaction. For a long time, I simply sat there, diary open, fingers tracing the ledger of my own careful generosity, reflecting on the innumerable small acts of trust one had extended, and how, finally, I had seen them for what they were. I could almost feel the weight of the years lift slightly, as if acknowledging the truth of my experience released a pressure I hadn't fully noticed. My hands, still slightly trembling, were steadier now, guided not by fear but by clarity. The road ahead would require patience, precision, and unwavering attention to detail. The same skills that had made me a math teacher, the same skills that had preserved my life for decades. Only now they would serve to restore what had been taken. The diary became my co-conspirator in that moment. It reminded me that memory is a form of power, and evidence is just another form of truth. I would gather every piece of paper, every email, every timestamp, every bank statement. I would assemble it not with rage, but with the careful precision of someone reclaiming her domain. I whispered again, this time with more conviction, "I'm not a ghost. I will get it all back." The words were no longer a promise to myself, they were a statement of inevitability. And as the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the hardwood floor, I felt the cold clarity settle fully in my bones. I understood the betrayal, I understood my power, and I understood that the rest would be methodical, deliberate, and fully within my control. I remember the moment I decided I could no longer sit in silence. The kitchen still smelled faintly of the cinnamon from my morning tea, and the autumn light was falling soft across the counter, but nothing around me felt ordinary anymore. My hands, which had once held chalk and spreadsheets with confidence, now trembled as they hovered over my phone. I dialed Janice Stewart, my attorney, the one I had trusted to understand numbers, contracts, and the law better than anyone I knew. Her voice, calm and practical, anchored me in a way that I hadn't realized I needed. "Janice," I said, keeping my voice steady though my stomach churned, "I need to challenge a power of attorney, and I need to recover what's mine." She didn't hesitate. She told me to gather everything. Statements, screenshots, emails, anything that could trace the money Evan and Madison had taken. And so I began the laborious process of reclaiming my life through evidence, one meticulous step at a time. I sat at my old oak desk, the one that had seen decades of my planning and lesson prep, and opened my carefully organized files. Each folder was a story in itself: receipts for groceries, tuition payments, small loans I had quietly given to Evan and Madison over the years. I lined them up like soldiers, each document a witness to my truth. I had saved $195,000 in total, but now, seeing the transfers $15,000 here, $28,000 there, I realized how much of that I had unwittingly handed over. My eyes burned as I traced each transaction, but anger was useless. I needed precision, not fury. Screenshots from the bank app became my maps. Emails, once innocuous, "How are you?" Messages now read like confessions when cross-referenced with account activity. Madison's smug reply to one inquiry about balances, Evan's careless, "I just did it to help" text. They were all pieces of the puzzle I had ignored for too long. But now, with Janice guiding me, each fragment became a nail in the coffin of their deception. I froze the accounts first. The relief was immediate, tangible, almost like breathing underwater and finally surfacing. For years, I had been invisible in my own financial life, and now I could see the ripple effect of my decisions beginning to work. I watched the confirmations arrive. Emails from the bank confirming freezes, notifications that no further withdrawals could occur. A sense of control settled over me, quiet but firm. Then came the formal challenge of the power of attorney. I signed the documents, my hand firm, the pen pressing into paper like a declaration. I was no longer the person who had trusted without question. Each signature, each form was a reclaiming of my autonomy. I filed copies, sent others to Janice, and carefully recorded every communication. The process was methodical, almost ritualistic. I spent hours compiling evidence of the jewelry sales, the mysterious deposits into Evan's apartment fund in Miami, the repeated forgot password excuses. Each detail, once a source of embarrassment, was now a weapon of clarity. I typed timelines, highlighted inconsistencies, and created spreadsheets linking amounts, dates, and signatures. It was laborious, and sometimes I had to close my eyes and take a deep breath to stop my hands from shaking, but the sense of purpose outweighed the exhaustion. By the end of that first week, I could feel a transformation taking hold. I had shifted from shock to strategy, from betrayal to action. I was no longer a passive observer in my own life. The house felt lighter, the rooms quieter, but my determination resonated in every corner. I would not only reclaim what had been taken, but also ensure that Evan and Madison could not continue to exploit the trust one had once given freely. I remember sitting back in my armchair, stretching my stiff shoulders, and allowing a quiet smile. It was not triumph in a dramatic sense. It was the serenity of a woman who had finally become her own guardian. I whispered to the empty room, almost as a promise to myself, "I'm not a ghost. I will get it all back." That whisper became my mantra over the following weeks. Each call to the bank, each email to Janice, each copy of a statement filed and double-checked reinforced a growing sense of control. Slowly, the tension in my chest eased. I was no longer running from betrayal. I was confronting it with the meticulousness I had taught my students in math class. Step by step, proof by proof, logic over emotion. And here's what happened next when I finally moved. After the whirlwind of phone calls, signatures, and legal notices, I could almost hear the echo of their arrogance receding from my life. Evan and Madison had always assumed I was a fixture to manipulate, a constant to borrow from, a quiet observer to nod along while they arranged their lives around my generosity. But that assumption shattered, and the cracks of consequence spread quickly, silently, like frost creeping over the edges of a window pane. It began with the simplest act, the freeze. I remember the day Janice called, voice tight with the satisfaction of procedure done correctly. "Laura, I've filed the injunction. Their accounts are frozen. They won't be able to move a cent until we go through the motions of untangling everything." My fingers trembled, not from fear, but from the strange, visceral satisfaction of control reclaimed. The sum of betrayal I had tracked meticulously, screenshots, bank statements, emails, all now became weapons, shields, and evidence rolled into one. I could almost feel Evan's heartbeat faltering in some distant city, though I had no desire to gloat. I only wanted the justice of balance restored. The next week was a revelation of how fragile their world had been built. Evan, who had swaggered through life assuming access to anything he wanted, discovered the weight of impotence. He called me once, trying to sound casual, masking panic beneath a forced tone. "Mom, hey, can you check if that transfer went through?" His voice cracked in the way only truth can make it crack. I stayed silent, listening. There was no warmth there, no manipulation, only a sudden raw awareness of his own vulnerability. I didn't answer immediately. I let the quiet work its effect. The power of being the one with agency settled deep in my chest, a warm, steady pulse after years of cold anxiety. Madison fared no better. She had woven herself into my emails, my accounts, my trust, thinking that smirks and subtle gestures were sufficient camouflage. But when I sent formal notices to her online businesses, warning partners and clients of potential fraud, I watched as her carefully constructed facade crumbled. Responses came back. Confused colleagues halted transactions, a sudden tightening of doors she had assumed were always open. She texted me once, curt and abrupt, no room for charm, no veneer of superiority. "Laura, this is ridiculous." I didn't reply. I sipped my tea instead, letting the steam curl around my fingers, feeling the enormity of quiet retribution. Ridiculous indeed. To see someone accustomed to power stumble because they misjudged who they were dealing with, it was almost a relief. The local banking authorities eventually called. They needed statements, proofs, signatures. I laid out everything meticulously. Every $28,000 transfer, the jewelry sold for Evan's apartment deposit, the POA signed while I was unconscious after surgery. As I walked them through each document, each time-stamped message, each photographic evidence of my dwindling savings, I noticed the expression that flickered across the investigator's face. It was recognition of something I had felt too long. that they had crossed the line and it would cost them. There was no hurry to speak of vengeance, just the methodical, inexorable application of truth. I was no longer invisible in my own life. I had become the observer who finally turned the lens back. The first real encounter with the consequences came when Evan tried to withdraw money from a vendor in Portland for what he insisted was business expenses. He was refused. "Your account is currently frozen due to legal proceedings," the clerk said. I heard about it later from a friend who worked there, and I couldn't suppress the small, satisfied nod that came naturally. Not triumph, not gloating, only recognition. Actions have weight. For once, the universe had been procedural, impartial, and unwavering in its reply to wrongdoing. Meanwhile, Madison's world contracted further. One of her small online partners, after receiving my formal notice, canceled a pending contract. Another froze a shipment, suspicious of her sudden lack of funds. I imagined her pacing, phone in hand, realizing for the first time that charm, smiles, and deceit had limits. That the world didn't revolve around her ability to manipulate. That the hand she had tried to control had slipped through her grasp. Evan and Madison had cultivated a sense of immunity, thinking that the mother they had used as a financial safety net would never assert herself. That assumption had cost them more than money. Cost them credibility. It cost them the illusions of control. Every call blocked, every email unanswered, every partner notified. It was a ripple of reality that reached them like a tide they could not stem. I didn't need to yell, to storm, or to dramatize. I had only to act, and the machinery of justice, combined with careful documentation, did the rest. In the quiet of my home, I often thought of the irony. I had spent decades teaching math, explaining logic, patterns, and cause and effect to teenage minds. And now, I was living a calculus of consequence, watching the principles I had revered play out in the world I had been betrayed in. There was an elegance in it, an order restored. What was taken under false pretenses was frozen, documented, and soon to be returned. Their lives were no longer untouched by accountability, and I, for the first time in years, could exhale without the weight of fear pressing on my chest. I also began to notice subtler shifts. Evan's calls ceased entirely. Madison stopped texting altogether. It was as if the invisible barrier of legal and moral consequence had created a zone in which I was untouchable. I was not vindictive. I was procedural, calm, and deliberate. Justice had been done not through rage, but through evidence, patience, and the unshakable assertion of one's rights. Sitting in my autumn garden, the scent of fallen leaves mingling with the faint aroma of brewed tea, I realized something else. The real victory wasn't in their punishment. It was in the restoration of my own life. The freedom to act, to spend, to decide, to exist without fear of manipulation. Evan and Madison had learned the hard way that actions, once taken, carry consequences, and the world does not bend to entitlement or deceit. It bends only to accountability, evidence, and integrity. By the end of the month, all official communications were complete. The accounts frozen, the partners notified, the POA under review. I watched, quietly, as the machinery of consequence ground on. They were no longer untouchable. I was no longer invisible. And in that realization I found something I hadn't expected. Not satisfaction alone, but peace. Balance had returned, not just in dollars but in dignity, in the assertion of self, in knowing with unwavering certainty that no one would ever again cross that line with me. I remember the first morning I sat at my kitchen table with my new bank card in hand. It wasn't flashy, just a plain, unassuming piece of plastic, but it felt like a crown. I slid it into the chip reader at the corner cafe, ordered my usual black tea with a dash of honey, and paid without a second thought. For the first time in years, the numbers on a screen were mine. Every dollar, every transaction felt deliberate in a way that carried a small but powerful weight. I had earned it, saved it, protected it, and now finally it was untouchable. I'd set up two-factor authentication, a practice I'd once thought unnecessary, laughing quietly at the memory of Evan rolling his eyes when I insisted on changing my passwords monthly. Now, each text alert, each confirmation beep from my phone, reminded me that I had a fortress built around my own life. I wasn't afraid of oversight anymore. I was overseeing. My garden, the one I had tended for decades with aching knees and calloused hands, seemed to bloom more vividly that autumn. The maple leaves outside my window caught fire in red and gold, a signal that change was not just possible, it was inevitable. I walked barefoot on the cool tiles of my kitchen, the hum of the refrigerator steady and comforting, and I realized how ordinary life could feel extraordinary when lived on your own terms. I could breathe without fear, sip my tea in peace, and listen to the wind rattle the window panes without imagining someone else watching, calculating, or judging. I started spending more time with friends who had quietly noticed my withdrawal over the years. We sat in a circle on my porch, hands wrapped around warm mugs, swapping recipes and memories. Laughter came easily, no longer punctuated by a sense of obligation or fear. It was the kind of laughter that fills spaces you didn't know were empty. And with each shared story, each smile, I felt the remnants of my old life, the betrayals, the quiet humiliations, shrink to a manageable size, tucked away into neat compartments where they could no longer rule me. Financial workshops became a new focus. I began hosting small sessions for women in my community, teaching them not just to manage accounts, but to recognize patterns of manipulation and regain autonomy. I explained the importance of reviewing statements personally, of knowing every password, of trusting instincts when they whisper that something is off. They listened intently, some nodding with tears in their eyes, and I realized that my story, my quiet battle, my careful reconstruction, was giving others courage to reclaim their lives too. There was a satisfaction in that, a sense of legacy that had nothing to do with inheritance or money, but with dignity and awareness. In the evenings, I would sit in my armchair by the window, a wool scarf draped around my shoulders, a cup of chamomile steaming on the side table. I watched the twilight settle over Portland, the sky a soft gradient of lavender and rose. Sometimes I would let my mind wander back to the accounts that had once been compromised, to the jewelry that had vanished, to the texts I had received that cut through my trust like knives. But now I didn't feel anger as I once had. I felt measured satisfaction. Those losses were lessons, carefully priced in wisdom rather than dollars. I knew exactly where I stood, and more importantly, I knew I was untouchable here, within these walls, within this life I had meticulously rebuilt. Freedom, I discovered, wasn't a loud declaration. It was the soft click of a lock on a cabinet holding my papers, the gentle weight of a pen as I signed a check to myself, the calm certainty that no one could touch my hard-earned savings again. Each day, each routine became a meditation in autonomy. Folding laundry while humming softly, watering the azaleas while the sun warmed my back, checking my new account balance not in fear, but in quiet triumph. I could plan trips to the coast, schedule lunches with old friends, or simply sit on the porch with a blanket, watching leaves fall without ever once wondering if someone else had the right to decide. I was rebuilding not just my finances but my sense of self. I was the architect, the custodian, the steady hand guiding the life I had almost lost. And in the midst of all this ordinary beauty, I realized something profound. The theft, the betrayal, the pain, all of it had given me clarity I would not have achieved otherwise. I was no longer just surviving, I was flourishing, fully, intentionally, unapologetically. And that, I thought, as the amber sunset reflected in my tea, is how a quiet life regains its strength. The numbers on the screen are mine, the keys in my hand are mine, and the peace in my heart is mine. I can rebuild, I can teach, I can live, and no one can take that from me again. How could they do this to me? I asked myself that every night for weeks, turning over every moment I'd trusted them, every dinner I'd prepared, every spare dollar I'd lent. I remember sitting in my garden this morning, the frost still clinging to the last stubborn leaves, and realizing something. I am not powerless. They will never have that hold over me again. The account numbers, the signatures, the stolen jewelry, all of it has been reclaimed, and the knowledge that I acted, quietly but decisively, rests heavier and firmer in my chest than any fear ever could. I am the keeper of my own life, my own finances, my own dignity. The autumn light spills across my cup of tea, and for the first time in a long time it feels like peace. They can try to return, to call, to explain, but I am done being anyone's shadow. I have boundaries. I have my voice. And I have my life. If this touched a nerve, you belong here. Subscribe to hear truths where silence becomes strength.